A Dharma talk is not an intellectual exercise. So when you're listening to the Dharma talk, you're not accruing knowledge. The Dharma talk's point is to awaken something. There's a Japanese word that it's teisho. We call it a Dharma talk. In Japanese Soto Zen, they call it a teisho. Teisho really means a shout. So tonight I'm going to talk about the Buddha's enlightenment, but I'm not going to talk about it from the perspective of trying to tell you the exact story. I guess what I mean is I'm not trying to inform you so much about the life of the Buddha. There's some wonderful books you can read. Karen Armstrong has this great book on the Buddha. It's a biography of the Buddha. And there's some good information in there and good stories. And I'm going to reference the story. But the point isn't for you to know the story. The point is to turn it back to yourself and see your story in it. This is about you and it's about me. It's not about the Buddha. In some ways, it's probably helpful to think of the Buddha as an icon or a metaphor. I watched this documentary once about the life of the Buddha, and they claimed in this documentary that until the British were in India, people didn't really think of the Buddha as a historical figure. They didn't imagine that he necessarily lived. And it was, in some ways, again, this also is metaphor, but as the Western rational mind went into the East, they brought with it something valuable. So the archaeologists of the British Empire did some research, and they discovered the trail of the Buddha, not only as a metaphor, but as an actual life lived. The beauty of that, I think, is that, again, the Buddha is no different than you and me. The Buddha was a human being. He was born. Now, in the myth, he was born out of the side of his mother. But he was still born of body, and the Buddha was a human being in the flesh. There's this Joseph Campbell used to talk about the hero's journey. And in some ways, the Buddha's life is a kind of hero's journey. But again, this isn't so important about the Buddha. Our lives are a hero's journey. What are we doing? We find ourselves in this world. We inherit the culture, the history, the beliefs, the ideas, the scientific investigation, the social turmoil. We're born into that. Every generation is different. Even in a family, 2 or 3 years or even 1 year apart, each child is actually born into a different family because the construction of the family is different. The addition of another person changes everything. And if you look back at your own family life, you probably can see there are ways that your family changed over time. So some of the older siblings might have experienced a lot different perspective on that change than the younger siblings. Each one of us has our own experience. And starting at the end point, the Buddha taught us that we can awaken to our own experience. We can awaken to our own lives. This occurs to me as I'm speaking to you. This happens in my house, and I'm sure it happens in your house too. Sometimes maybe you smell something you don't recognize. Or maybe things are out of place and you don't quite get what's going on. Our minds are so much of our consciousness is filled in by our history that we try to make sense of things. We try to make it make sense. So my wife and I have this thing in my house. If you smell something, if you smell smoke, it probably means there's fire. But it's easy to ignore what you perceive if it doesn't fit the mind state of what you think is true. So in some silly way, the Buddha's enlightenment was, when you smell smoke, look for fire. Very simple. There's thousands of volumes. There's so much written on what the meaning of the Buddha was. But fundamentally, it means trust your experience. Believe in your true nature. The word Buddha means awaken. Somebody asked him, "Who are you?" He said, "I am awake." So our practice is oriented towards awakening and being awake. Zen practice is alive. So it's manifesting awakeness right now. Before this talk started, I had a long day. I had a lot of clients, many different things happened. I've had meetings, there's all sorts, and my energy is a little low. But that's before I sat down here. Now I'm here. Now my task is to be present and alive with these words. That's our task as human beings. Whatever our condition is, whatever situation we find ourselves in, wake up and be alive and respond. So, the biographical details of the Buddha. He was born somewhere 2,600 years ago, on and off. There's some new research that says maybe it was 2,700 or 2,800 years ago. That's a long time. And remember, things that we take for granted were not even understood at that time. So the Buddha, who began to teach about compassion, about open-heartedness, about a way to work with our negative, I don't like that word, but our strong anger, desire, our passions. The Buddha's basic teaching was that we can work with them in such a way that we're not controlled by them. Oftentimes we Westerners, when we come to practice, we think we will get rid of them and then we will be free. Most of us who've been practicing a long time have come to the realization that they don't disappear. But we are able to work with it. We can recognize them. We're awake with them. And in many ways, we can learn how to use them to help not only ourselves, but the awakening of all beings. So the Buddha himself was born into a very wealthy family. His father was the king. His father was the boss. Everybody served the king. Small little area probably in the area that straddles Nepal and India right now. And when he was born, there was a fortune told that said either the Buddha was going to be a great political figure, like a king, or he was going to be a great religious person, religious spiritual master. His father did not want a spiritual master. That was the last thing his father wanted. And as I am telling the beginnings of this story, it's important to know that his mother died 7 days, 10 days, 7 days after he was born. And it was his aunt, his mother's sister, who raised him. So, if you think of this metaphoric journey, he starts out in a world of grief. His mother died. Yeah, his aunt stepped in. But you have to imagine there's something happened early on. The Buddha's early life is marked with a lot of denial and I think the way I would say it is being lied to. Because his father was afraid, and remember, this is metaphor, this is story. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Think about how it impacts your life. But in this, you may not have been born, none of us probably in this room were born anywhere, in a situation anywhere near the wealth and comforts that the Buddha had. But even that was disturbed by this death of his mother. But the way I would imagine it, nobody wanted to talk about it. Because his father decided that the best way to make him a king and not a spiritual leader was to keep him away from the pain and suffering of the world. This is a preposterous story in a way, but he was kept in the palace, and all of his desires were met. And in Buddhism, we talk about the 4 heavenly messengers of poverty, sickness, old age, and death. And his father was trying to prevent him from knowing about these messengers in order to keep him oriented towards political power, knowledge, and understanding. But he was left, I would say, separated from his spiritual self. And as I say that, I know for myself, it took until probably my mid-teens till some spiritual center opened up. My grandfather lived with us, he was religious, but he wasn't spiritual. He followed the rules, but he didn't. And my parents were basically not connected to that side at all. And I was put through the motions of a religious education, religious training, but there was no depth to it. There was nothing. It was all pretty materialistic. So the Buddha was born into this materialistic world in which he was the pampered prince. That worked for, 25 years, 26, 27 years. And somehow he started to get curious. So he arranged with his attendant to leave the temple, the palace, See? Quite a big difference in this story. And when he left the palace, on his first trip out, I believe it was, that he saw a sick person. And he'd never seen it before. Now again, this is a preposterous story. There were all sorts of people in the palace, servants, family members. And it must have been that as soon as somebody sneezed, they were pulled away. If their hair started to turn gray, they had to be separated. So much had to go in to keeping him hidden from sickness, poverty, old age, and death. But he started to have an inkling, something's off here. That moment, I know for myself, was a very critical moment in my own spiritual life, in my own search for meaning, understanding, wisdom, and compassion. And many of us, we like to avoid that discomfort. Something's wrong here. But yet, it's from that place that we awaken. I think I resonate with the story personally because growing up, especially by the time I was in high school now, to be fair, like I said, everything is dependent on the moment that we're alive. So I was 15 years old in 1968. In 1968, from my vantage point, the whole world was in turmoil. Demonstrations, assassinations, and being of a young age during the Vietnam War, it was an awakening to what was happening and honestly the personal risk to myself. And in that year, I went through a tremendous transformation politically from being kind of conservative and believing the stories that I had been told, to suddenly opening to the possibility of something else. That moment is a very important moment. It seems to me all of us in this room, we wouldn't be in this room if there wasn't some question, some wonder, some curiosity. For me, it seemed like what I was being taught was all a lie. It was one-sided, and it seemed like I hadn't been told the truth my whole life. That moment is the moment of awakening. That moment is the moment, well, if it's not true, then what is true? So when the Buddha discovered these things that he never knew before, he was convinced that he was lied to. He was convinced that the world that he was given was sheltered and not fully real. So he left home. That leaving home is a very important first step, or second step, or third step, whatever step you're on. There's a moment where you have to leave what's kept you comfortable and take a risk. That's what leaving home means. You're taking a risk. You're saying, I don't understand. I don't really know what it is, but I have to find it. My poor father, who had to deal with all of what went on with me at that time, he used to get so frustrated. He'd say, you're very good at telling me what you don't know, or what you don't want, and what you don't like, but you never say what you do like and what you do want. And, I had some ideas, but I didn't know. And he was right. But where he was wrong, I think, was he failed to recognize the power and the importance of that moment. That moment that you don't understand. A couple of weeks ago, Paul was giving his Dharma talk, and he was talking about Thanksgiving, and he kept using the word awkward. And if you remember, those of you who were here, I really picked up on that. We don't like to be awkward, but that moment of awkwardness is an opening. If we're willing to be awake to it, if we're willing to enter into it, to feel it, to look at it, to work with it, things can change. So that moment, there's the moment of, I have a question. Something's not quite right. Doesn't add up. And then there's the moment, I'm going to find out. So the Buddha left home, and for our cultural viewpoint, there's a real hitch in this story, because the Buddha left his wife and young child. 5 years old, 6 years old, something like that. And he left. Most of us these days would call that quite irresponsible. Now, the child and the mother were still in the palace. I suppose their needs were taken care of. It's not like they have to go on welfare in order to make ends meet, although actually it is a kind of welfare. They were just pampered by the accumulated wealth of this rich king. But this 27, 28-year-old said, I gotta go. And it was the custom in the time in India to leave home and to do the spiritual search. Buddha wasn't the first one to do it. He was following what was going on at the time in India, in his world. And he went out and he looked for spiritual masters. And he kept meeting these yogis who would teach him, and he would master what they were teaching him, but it wasn't enough. His question was so deep and so powerful that he realized it wasn't enough to just get somebody else's wisdom. What's my wisdom? What's my experience? Again, it's not about understanding. It's about finding yourself. Zen Master Bon Soeng, our founding teacher, would say, attaining your true self. So he was on this quest. And he was, as I said, he was following the style of the day. So there was a belief at that time that to awaken your spiritual self, you just about had to kill your physical body. So they really didn't eat much, if at all. If you see, sometimes you see these images of the Buddha where you can see his ribs underneath his skin. And that image comes from this kind of practice. Almost like physical, it's not really mutilation, I'm not sure the right word, but you're literally almost killing yourself in order for something to happen. And a story I like quite a bit is, at that point, he was, like hanging on by a thread, and he had a memory. This comes out of Karen Armstrong's book. It's a very interesting story. It may be well known to others, but it was the first I had seen it. And he had a memory that he was 5 or 6 years old. And remember, he was this pampered boy who they were trying, his father was conspiring with people to keep him sheltered so he wouldn't become a spiritual person. So it was a harvest festival one fall, and the whole village, the whole town, I don't know, just imagine they're out in the fields, they're harvesting. I think it had to do with the apple, with fruit being ripe. And he said he remembered that, very strangely, there were some moments that he was left alone. Imagine, he always has somebody on him to control him. But there was this moment, probably the people who were caretaking him got swept up into the celebration of the moment, and he was alone. And he remembered that this is where he's barely hanging on to life in the depth of the despair of his spiritual journey. And he remembers that at that moment he had this experience of awakening, you could say. He was alone, and he had this kind of blissful opening. And this helped him realize that he was on the wrong path. It was his first inkling of the middle way. Not too tight, not too loose. He moved away from the extreme deprivation that he was practicing. And I suppose the story goes that, of course, this is so convenient, in walks a woman selling milk. So he takes the milk and he drinks it. And then his 5 friends said, well, we're out of here. You just broke the whole thing. You've just lost your way. We're gone. So he's left by himself. But he so believed what his experience was telling him that he followed his way. So he started to drink. His body started to get strength. And since I am not a scholar, I'm a little unclear on how long this, in his journey, where this sits, but it was the beginning of his awakening. In our calendar, we celebrate Buddha's Enlightenment Day on December 8th. I think the Japanese have that. In Korea, there's something about December 8th, but more, since on the lunar calendar, it's more the 8th day of the last month. So you're really more into February or March. But one night, it opened. And the way I like to say it is he realized that he was the universe was him. And he realized that not only was that true for him, but it was true for all beings, which means you and me. We are the universe. All of the universe manifests itself right here, right now, in this configuration that we're sitting in. We're so locked into our our personal self, our small idea of who we are, that what we're missing is our connection, our oneness, if you will, with the entire universe. We think the stories of our lives are who we are. But the Buddha taught that there's something deeper, something more fundamental that perhaps we could say is shaped or expressed in the coming and going of our everyday life. But there's something before that. As I was thinking about this talk, the image came to me of a placid lake. That's before the rock gets thrown in the lake. And once the rock gets thrown in, there are all these ripples. Depending on where it gets thrown, how it gets thrown, will determine what the ripples are. So, the first enlightenment, if you will, is the placid lake. The second enlightenment is the ripples, just as they are, before we name them, before we make a story about them. Just as it is. So in that state, you could say just this, before you make a story of these that I'm holding up. Just see, just hear, without adding anything. And then the third step is stepping into the everyday world and with wisdom, love, and compassion, finding a way to live that helps this world and heals this world. So those three things tell us how to practice. The first is connect below the surface, before anything. You can't say it, you can't point to it, just before everything. The second is see things as they are, clearly, concisely, without adding anything. And then the third step is use your wisdom, compassion to help. And in many ways, too simply, that's all this practice is about. Attain your true self. See things as they are, not as you believe them to be. That's a very difficult task. All of these things. It's not easy. And use that wisdom and compassion and love that grows out of that to make the world a better place. After the Buddha had his enlightenment experience, he figured, nobody's going to get this. I'm done. And I don't know, it was some spiritual something who came to him and said, try. Maybe you're right, but maybe you're wrong. So he got up and he found those 5 friends who left him when he drank that milk. And lo and behold, they listened to him. And they recognized that actually he was onto something. So they became his students. So even after his enlightenment, he was wrong. It's funny, I never thought of it that way. He still needed somebody to say, try, go ahead. So we can talk about what that means. What hits me right now is, don't get too full of yourself. Yeah, you've got something. All of us have something. But all of us need everybody else to help us know what to do with it. So many times when I'm working with people, we focus so much on what's wrong with us that we miss our power, our incredibleness. And it takes somebody to see that in us, to help us attain what we already are. So To have the eyes of the Buddha means to see Buddha in everything and everyone. If we can live like that, again, easy to say, hard to do, the world changes. Everything is different. So attain your true self. You can't even imagine what it is. I'm saying like a placid lake, but that's just an image. Find it for yourself. See things clearly. A lot of our practice is recognizing the spin we add to things. And once you recognize it, you can have a moment of pulling it away and just seeing. Again, just this, even calling it beads, is too much. Beads is just the name. Our formal teaching style, we would say, if you call these beads, you're attached to name and form. They don't call these beads in China. They don't call them beads in India or in Italy or in France. There's a different name for it. So if you just think they're beads, you're missing the point. But if you deny them, then we say you're attached to emptiness. So we always ask, without being attached to name and form, and without being attached to emptiness, what is this? These questions are a way to pull ourselves forward, to meet the moment, to attain our innate wisdom, love, and compassion, and to act, to be it. We don't study the Buddha, we are the Buddha. The Buddha is not some distant thing, it is us. The Buddha's awakening is our awakening. So we work and we practice to be able to manifest it. But even if we never see it, it doesn't mean it's not there. There's a line from the Sixth Patriarch where he says, the only difference between an enlightened person and an unenlightened person is that the enlightened person realizes it. We're all the same. We all have different skills, we all have different DNA. We're all a particular product of something that we don't even understand. Sometimes lately I've been thinking maybe DNA is all it is and everything else is what surrounds it. And we get caught in what surrounds it. And maybe reincarnation is just conception. The thing about all of us is there's never been anything like us before. Each one of us is a unique combination of DNA, or whatever DNA is. I remember hearing years ago that there's a name, most of our DNA, the scientists don't quite understand, so they call it junk DNA. And I think it's like 75%. And when I heard that, it said, it's probably all that it means is they don't get it yet. But it's junk because we don't get it. Everything matters. Each thing, each moment is the expression of this mystery. And the story of the Buddha's enlightenment, the story of the Buddha's journey, is our story, and it's a metaphor to keep us engaged, alive into it, to really be as fully human as we are.